So again, you are all very, very welcome this evening for me or wherever you are in the world. I know that various areas are opening up. Some areas are rolling back. So wherever you are, hopefully you are safe and doing well. As we can see on the screen, for those of you that have been with us for our first two, thank you so much. We are now on round 3 of our Global Book Club for the language of coaching. And as I've said on each of these, for me, it was important to do whatever I can to give back during this time. And obviously, while there's a cost for purchasing the book, which hopefully is a valuable one, I wanted to make sure that everyone, even if they couldn't get access to the book, could be able to benefit from the information, not only through this 4-part open source series, but also the mini course, again, that's on the languageofcoaching.com. For this evening now, we are getting into some topics that I feel really excited about. Not that our first 2 sessions weren't top of the table, so to speak, for me, but now we're starting to get into the heartbeat of the book. And so if you weren't with us on the first 2 sessions, we discussed chapters 1 through 3. Those are now in the bank, and what we'll be going through tonight are chapters 4 and 5, titled Finding Focus and Cue It Up. For this evening, we're really going to start to get into the concepts around cueing and communication. We've discussed attention, we've discussed memory, we've discussed learning, but now we get to start to see how do we shape attention in service of memory and learning, notably in our case, so that our athletes, our clients, and our patients are moving better. So very exciting topics and a lot to get through. So let's crack on. So the first chapter that we are going to discuss this evening is Finding Focus. So chapter 4 in the book. And the goal behind this chapter, simply put, was to pay legacy to all of the science related to cueing and communication as it specifically relates to teaching movement. And you met some very important characters in this chapter. You learned about Dr. Gabrielle Wolfe, who I'll discuss again here in a couple slides. You learned about Timothy Galway, who wrote an unbelievable book called The Inner Game of Tennis back in 1974. And we started to unpack the evidence in a story-based narrative that starts to give us as movement professionals an insight around how our language shapes, influences, and at times negatively impacts movement, with the hope that if you have this science and this evidence, you can start to form your own thoughts around cueing. But obviously within the book, I didn't want to leave anything to chance, which is why after Finding Focus, we get into this concept of cue it up. How do we take this evidence and bring it to life in our language and the way we coach individuals? So this chapter opens up with a very important image. And this graphic, I think, if you would, summarizes really what great coaching is about and behaviorally what great coaching requires. And so we touched on some of these ideas in our first 3 chapters, but now we get to bring it together. And that is a coach's chief responsibility. And whether, again, you're a coach, a trainer, a physio, if you are a movement professional, it is your chief responsibility to, 1, capture the attention of the person you are working with. Only the things we pay attention to can we learn from. But obviously, we have to hold attention long enough, so we have to keep it. And once we capture and keep it, then we have the opportunity to direct it. But where we're at now is, okay, let's say I've got the attention. They've bought in, they're ready to go. What should they focus on? And I've said this a number of times, but let me reiterate it. Even though the book is called The Language of Coaching, ultimately, what are our words meant to do? Our words are meant to influence their thoughts, their focus, their intention, such that by improving that intention while they move better. And they move better in a manner that doesn't require you to remind them of the cue, but rather the cue gets downloaded, embedded into their motor system, such that they learn, they own the change. And the words, if you would, go by the wayside. And it's what those words mean. It's the experience those words promote. That is all embedded in this idea of how to direct attention and intention through our language. And that most certainly is what we're going to talk about tonight. And even though I'm talking about language, understand that the mechanisms that influence focus and the way that focus influences movement, it doesn't require a coach to give that cue. It doesn't require a coach to share that language. Ultimately, what we're really talking about is how the nature of the mind influences the nature of movement. And so these principles are at play, even if you as the coach are not engaging them with any cues. This is why part of our responsibility is to help our athletes, our clients, and our patients understand and recognize the power and the influence the mind has over the way they move. And most certainly, in various forms and stories, even the example I used earlier in the book on how you can teach attention by having someone put their arm out, be strong, and then distract them and show them how their strength can go away. As long as we are illustrating, demonstrating to our population that what they focus on while they move is a critical, influential variable in the quality and the speed with which they learn to move, then I think we are doing them a great service, right? And we'll get into that more and more as the night goes on. So now that we understand that we are at the stage of directing attention, I want to open up with a global conversation around how we do that. Now, the namesake of the book is The Language of Coaching. But if we look at language from a coaching perspective and the way we use it to focus attention, we use language in a diversity of forms. It's not just in what we see here in the middle of the screen, cues. And so when I was writing the book, I said, hold on. I have to make sure I practically and authentically represent all the different ways we use communication. That way, when I'm talking about cueing, and specifically the type of cues we should use to guide movement, the reader, the practitioner can understand that anything I suggest removing, cleaning out of your cues, i.e. foreshadowing here, internal language, I want to show the reader, the practitioner, where that information can be used. And thus I conceptualize this idea of the coaching communication loop. You know, if you've read this far in the book, you know that I'm a fan of music. And so this idea of a loop or a song on a loop really resonated with me. And so the frame I want you to put yourself in is you're in the gym or you're on the field, but you're in the training environment. You are in the learning environment. And thus, while there's communication that goes on between sessions, one-on-one meetings, maybe even team reviews, I'm not getting into the use of language in those scenarios. We're specifically looking at the way we use language when we are coaching in a learning and teaching environment. And so each of these 5 categories that I put in there as the DDC-DD model to try to get something catchy in your mind so it's easy to remember, these circulate, these surround each of these teaching scenarios at the drill level, the rep level, or however you've organized your session. And I talk about these loops in terms of a long loop, as you can see denoted by the blue, and a short loop, which is denoted by the orange. And let's talk about the difference between these loops briefly before we break each category down. The long loop, as I outline in the book, is really for those initial lessons, those initial scenarios where you're teaching a movement or you're teaching a drill for the first time. And notably then, if you're working with a novice, if you're working with a person for the first time, you'll use the long loop quite a bit until they've developed the understanding of everything that you teach. But obviously, even if you're working with a very experienced person, you might introduce new drills and new concepts. And it's in those moments that I'm suggesting that we revert to the long loop. However, once we've worked with someone long enough and they have a general knowledge and understanding of a given drill of a given movement, we can then abandon, shorten, if you would, the long loop in favor of what we'll call the short loop. And the short loop is the Swiss Army knife of coaching. It's the three major phases that relate to teaching any and every movement. The cue, which happens before, the do it, which is the physical movement action, and then the debrief at the end, right? So without getting ahead of ourselves, understand that using the 5 components here, we have the long loop and the short loop. One is for teaching something for the first time or a novice. The other one is your Swiss Army knife, the one you'll use all the time with all populations once they have a working understanding of the movements or drills you're going through. And so now let's go through each of these one by one. The first 2 phases of the long loop are what we call the describe it and demonstrate it phases or categories. The describe it is exactly what it sounds like, as illustrated in the image. You're describing the upcoming movement. Here I have an example where possibly you are showing some video, or you're going through other kinds of visual graphics. I'm not going to put any constraints on this. The key piece is you are describing verbally what's going to happen, and you are demonstrating, either in the literal form, as you can see in the imagery, or again, in video form. Now, I want to draw your attention to the circulating arrows. The circulating arrows are to suggest you can describe or demonstrate in any order. I'm not going to say that one has to go first or second. You need to have that adaptability to work with the individual. And in certain instances, you might just demonstrate with very minimal descriptions. In other cases, you might just give a description and not demonstrate at all. So ultimately, those two work together, if you would, to give the athlete or the client the working knowledge, the working understanding, cognitively speaking, of what they're about to go through. From there, then we shift into a cue. We understand that when we're giving that, hey, this is the drill we're going to go through. These are the body positions we're looking for. Okay, I'm now going to demonstrate it. Oh, as you would have seen this and this. We give a lot of information when we're teaching for the first time. And even when we're reminding people, at times we can fall into this trap of giving too much information. And so ultimately, I think what a lot of us do intuitively is we say, now, to do this, right, insert breath here, I want you to focus on X. And it's that last brief phrase you use right before the movement that we are calling the cue. Now, I want to give you a little bit of nuance here around a common problem that I see. And that is, oftentimes we'll see very good, short, precise cues actually get lodged inside of a long-winded description, such that I might be saying, hey, today we're working on your acceleration. Remember, from head to heel, I want you nice and long, good, powerful knee drive forward, good aggressive arm action, nice and tight. I want you driving your knee forward as if to blast through the glass, never forgetting to push back. You see what I've done there? I've mixed up my descriptive language that is describing the technique and some of the details, which frankly is just meant there to elevate their understanding, their general knowledge about the movement. But hiding inside of there were cues like push the ground away or drive the knee forward to explode through the glass. These are brilliant cues that should formulate the spotlight, should centrate the spotlight of the mind. And so the first practical recommendation I'm going to give you is make sure that you leave space for that cue to live by itself. Once you do your description and demonstration, take that momentary pause. To do this now, I want you to focus on X. By highlighting that, it increases its importance in the athlete's mind. And we know this kind of idea of the peak end rule, that for any given experience, you remember the peak of it, the most interesting thing, and the end of it. And so by understanding that that's how we cognitively are wired, make sure that the cue, the most important focus point, is the last thing you say. The other nuance I want to highlight here, outside of pulling your cue outside of your description, is this. The cue doesn't always need to come from you as the coach. Now, this topic will probably come up again today. It most certainly will come up in 2 weeks' time when we talk about analogies and the roadmap to apply this. But the cue ultimately can be out of a discussion. You may ask the athlete, hey, you know that we need to focus on getting better extension and getting push away off the ground. How do you think you need to focus on that? You know, I've been telling you to push the ground away, but does that make sense to you? Does that work for you? Is there possibly a cue that in your mind would work better? Now, be clear, I'm not saying you always have to do that. Working with a new athlete who hasn't developed the general body awareness or understanding of the skills probably would benefit early on from you giving them a couple tester cues, almost like training wheels on a bike. But inevitably, as you mature from the long loop to the short loop and their understanding of the skill improves, involving them in the cue creation is valuable. One, it gives them autonomy. They feel motivated, especially if they come up with a cue that happens to work. And it allows you to sample, as I talk about later on in the book, their language locker. You use them to understand the exact words that make sense. And so even though this book is called The Language of Coaching, I could have come up with other titles around collaboration. And collaboration for me is key. So a little bit of a rant there, but these are important nuances that I want to make sure punch through, because oftentimes there are only 1 or 2 lines in the book itself. From the cue then, we pause and we allow them to perform. They do it. Now, you can see here, insofar as the do it, I note silence or single word sounds to highlight tempo. It is a big pet peeve in myself and when I see other coaches doing this, that oftentimes we try to use the time while they're moving to present and provide information. We couldn't identify a worse time to give information. Case in point, have you ever had someone doing a single leg activity, a balancing activity, for which you say, good job, and they fall over? It's a simple matter of distraction. You've read an entire chapter on attention. We know it's limited in capacity. So give them the cue or work with them to identify the cue and let them write it out. Possibly for 1 rep, possibly for multiple sets. It just depends on how they are responding. And then finally, once they get done doing it, then we are going to debrief it. Athlete and coach feedback is considered. And when we talk about athlete plus coach feedback is considered, this is where you want to map objectively what you observed and how you feel it went with what they physically experienced. And as we'll come to see, the best cues tend to do 2 things. 1, they positively impact the movement. That means they immediately work, or at the least did not make the movement worse. But the second key attribute of an effective cue is that they had a positive experience with it, meaning they felt like the movement improved. Interestingly, when you get people who are at a very expert level and there's not a whole lot of room for technical improvement, don't expect that your cues will always make big changes in the body, because there's a bit of a ceiling effect. There's not much room, quantitatively speaking, to make further change. However, at that stage, the cueing is more about the sense and the repeatability of that sense as it relates to effective movement. And so cueing arguably becomes even more important the more expert-like someone becomes, because those cues, key word here, become ritualized, meaning they're ritualized into pre-movement routines. This is what's going on in the mind of the track athlete before they push out of the blocks. This is what's going on in the mind of the baseball player before they step into the box, so on and so forth. So let's not fool ourselves. Over time, our cues become the mental narrative, the mental ritual that our athletes use to get into, if you would, and trigger that flow state that they all want to have, whether they're the weekend warrior or they're the elite athlete. And so what we see here is we have our 5 stages, our 5 categories, the short loop and the long loop. Notably, I want you to shift down to that second level. It's key to understand that on the fringes of this model, your description and your debrief dabble in what I call the what of the movement. What happened? Knee went here, heel went there, hip went here, body went there, so on and so forth. Whereas in the middle, more akin, if you would, to implicit, automatic, field-based movement, we have the how. How do I achieve the what? How information is sampled from visual demonstrations, how information is sampled from cues phrased in the right way, i.e. external or analogy-based, as we'll get into, and how is developed through the actual experience of performing the movement. Both sources of information, the how and the what, are critical, but we have to understand that they're critical for different reasons. Information that we talk about in the description and the debrief is elevating their knowledge of the movement, which helps create buy-in, that you know what you're talking about. It allows you to lower anxiety because now they know what they're getting into, and thus there's less uncertainty or less unfamiliarity with what they are going into. But that language and its psychological purpose around understanding explicitly is different than the type of information the athlete needs to use or the client needs to use to learn better, which is more the province of implicit learning, automaticity, and feeling the movement come to life versus thinking their way to bring the movement to life. And I talk about this as being the difference between knowledge and know-how. Knowledge and know-how. If all that was needed to move effectively was knowledge, movement professionals would be the best at movement. And we know as movement professionals, we have way more knowledge about the movements we teach than our athletes, our clients, and our patients. Yet it doesn't necessarily mean that one-to-one we can move better to them. So knowledge by itself is not enough. Know-how. How can I actually bring it to life? And I put this in an Instagram post today. Our athletes here are not judged by their knowledge of the movement. They're judged by their ability to do it. And too often we confuse elevating our athletes' knowledge of the movement with the actual coaching language that helps them do it better, which hopefully is why you're interested in this book and these topics. Now, in going through all of that, which hopefully at this point is clear, what I want to now highlight is this. The remainder of the book focuses on this specific section of the communication loop, and that is the cue it portion. We are interested with the last idea that enters the athlete, client, or patient's mind before they move. Why? Simply put, the last idea is going to have the most dominant feature on how it shapes intention, focus, or attention, whatever synonym you would like to use. And so all this dissertation information around the body, the drill, what to do, all goes out the window while they're performing it. We need to give them one headlight, one spotlight, one flashlight, one destination. Again, whatever synonym or analogy you want to use to guide how they bring that movement into the real world. And that comes through this protected area we call the cue. As a final point here, and I'm spending more time on this slide than I will on any other because that's how important it is. There are going to be certain types of language, notably, as I'm sure all of you know if you've read this chapter, internal language, that I'm going to encourage you to remove insofar as your cues are concerned. But guess what? That internal language can certainly and should live in your descriptions of the movement and your debrief and discussions of the movement. Again, internal language is the province of the what. The what. What should the movement look like? What should happen? But external cues on environment, on outcomes, an analogy, a figurative version of an environment or an outcome, that's the province of the how. How to actually perform this movement, to bring all that detail to life in a simple way that will not cause me to choke or at the very least stunt my ability to efficiently learn. And this leaves us with our final point here, and that across the continuum, we have instances where we are trying to give knowledge and generate understanding. And there are other instances where we are trying to generate know-how, how to physically do it, knowledge versus doing. And the cue is specifically designed to upgrade know-how, to use verbal language in a manner that our implicit motor system, the automatic part of our brain, if you would, can understand. That's the key here. So hopefully that sets a nice context for what we're talking about and where the language that you use to coach needs to go. From here, once we set the stage in chapter 4 for the communication loop, we start to get into the science. And I'd like to spend a brief moment paying homage to really, if people have called me the king of cues, she must be the queen of cues, and that is Dr. Gabrielle Wolf. And so Dr. Gabrielle Wolf tells a wonderful story, which I retell in the language of coaching, where she is out windsurfing in Lake Garda, which is in Italy. And she buys herself, as anyone would, a magazine which articulates how to windsurf, but notably this specific movement called the power jibe. And now I've never gone windsurfing, but my understanding of the power jibe is where you are trying to suddenly move the sail, catch the wind in a very specific way, and it allows you to flip around. And I'm assuming all this takes place to make sure that the wind is quite literally behind you in your sail. And so when we look at this movement, it's quite complex. And I put some examples in the book of the kind of cues one would expect to read if the power jibe was being detailed out. And so Gabby Wolf is going through this experience, and she's trying to step by step go through this movement pattern, thinking about her feet and her hips and her body and her hands. And inevitably, after a morning of frustration, she abandons all of that detail and says, listen, really what this is telling me to do is push the board here and push the sail there. And so her mind drifts away from her body into the environment, thinking about the board and the sail. And all of a sudden, everything clicks, and she's power jibing. She's doing it. And as a psychology, I think postdoc at this point, working in Germany, she decides, well, this is a study here. And so her very first study, which was published in 1998 on the topic of internal versus external cueing, thinking about my body and my body movement versus thinking about the outcome, the goal the movement is trying to achieve, she, in the spirit of her windsurfing experience, grabbed this device, as you can see on the screen, which more or less mimics a skiing dynamic balance action. And she gave three different groups, of subjects cues. The internal group were told to push through their outer foot or their outer feet with the goal of being to move to the left and to the right as far and as fast as you can. The external focus group was told to push through the outer wheels. And then a control group was simply told to perform to the best of their ability. And sure enough, what she found was not only during practice, when the cues were being delivered, but when they brought these individuals back, whatever it was, a day or two later, to undergo a retention test, which we would have talked about in chapter 1, that the group that had focused externally not only outperformed the internal group in training, in practice, but notably during the retention test. And so she's like, holy smokes, this small difference between push through the outer wheels, which would be analogous to pushing through the outer edge if you were skiing or snowboarding, versus pushing through the outer foot made a difference. And what is amazing about this is she submits this study into the Journal of Motor Behavior, and it's rejected. They cannot believe something so trivial could actually make a difference. Was it a statistical artifact? Who knows? And so she was encouraged by Charles Shea, I believe it was, to go back and replicate her findings, generalize her findings using a different activity. And so her second activity was a stabilometer. And basically that's a fancy word for a dynamic balance board that tells you how far and how fast you are moving to the left and to the right, which gives obviously an actual numeric value for how effective you are at balancing. Obviously, if you're balancing, you want to make these rapid, small movements versus these large, infrequent movements. And so again, she took two groups in this case. Internal, the internal group was told to keep their feet at the same height. And then an external group that literally had kind of like this, just a piece of tape right in front of their feet. And they were told to keep these two pieces of tape at the same height. Again, we're talking about maybe an inch difference between the foot and the piece of tape. And what they found, interestingly enough, is that there was no difference in improvement in balance during training, but that when they brought them back a day or so later to look at how much had been retained, how much had actually been learned, so to speak, the group that was given the external cues outperformed the internal. And thus, if you read the 1998 paper by Wolf, Hobb, and Prince, you'll notice there is not one study, but there is two. And you now know the colorful backstory of why there is two. And even Gabrielle Wolf herself would have said she could not believe such a small difference in language could make such a profound difference in outcome, especially in the context of a single session. Now, this study was done in 1998. We are talking some 22 years later, and my numbers are not accurate, but somewhere in the vicinity of 160 papers, easily plus, have now been published on the back of this, evaluating the difference between should we think about our body and our technique while we move, or should we focus and form our mind around the environment we're trying to influence and the outcome we are trying to achieve. And while most areas of science tend to have a certain flavor of it depends, the amount of research in favor of an external focus and an analogical equivalent is profound. My estimates put it well over 96% of the evidence is suggesting that we should focus externally. Now, are there instances possibly where internal language, in terms of what we think about while we move, are there instances where it could be valuable? Certainly. We just haven't found many of them, if any of them, as of yet. And I will touch on this again towards the end, but the key thing here is right now, we understand that an external cue seems to cause a principled, consistent reaction in the way we move, such that for me, this is a law of teaching, or at least approaching a law of teaching, that if you are going to default to a language, you want to find the external or analogical equivalent that this person can understand, relate to. That ultimately, when compared to an equivalent internal cue, will reap far better rewards in the magnitude, I would say, of in over 96% of the cases. But let's continue to look at some of the evidence here. Within this idea of cueing, though, there's oftentimes a critique, and I believe the critique is justified, that we shouldn't make this dichotomous or binary around just internal and just external. And I completely agree in that not all internal cues are created equal. Some internal cues, in my opinion, and I believe the evidence would suggest this, are more detrimental than others. But equally, not all external cues are created equal. You still have to find the right cue for the person. But again, on the whole, if you identify the right external cue compared to the equivalent internal, you're going to have far better success with the external focus. But let's look at this as what I called in the book a continuum of cues to make sure that we can identify the different flavors, increasing the odds that we have a clearer understanding of creating the external cues we desire. And so if we think of this like a zoom lens on a camera, we can start zoomed all the way into technique in what is labeled as number one. And this is the idea of a narrow internal cue. And so a narrow internal cue in the case of sprinting might be extend your hips as explosively as you can. And so it references a single joint or a single muscle. If you would, you are cueing a micro unit of movement, one area amongst many that are involved in the pattern, in this case, sprinting. Now, if we think again like a zoom lens and we zoom out just a little bit, we go from narrow to broad. And broad, we can see here, drive your leg back as explosively as you can. Rather than referencing any one joint, I am referencing a limb, a segment of the body. Now, when we look at internal, narrow, and broad, there was one study, I believe it was done by Brad McKay, that looked at the difference between these in a broad jump. And in his study, he did not find any differences. However, I am of the belief that a broad internal cue is going to be far less detrimental than a narrow internal cue, simply because it is less constraining. When I tell you to extend your hips, if you commit to that cue, you are putting your attention on only one, if you would, degree of freedom amongst many that are involved in sprinting. However, if I tell you to drive your leg back, I'm generally orienting your mind, right, your body to the ground, but in a less constrained manner, because I'm not articulating exactly how to do that or what joints to physically use. And recently, there was a paper on a rowing ergometer. Now, mind you, it was not looking at technique. It was simply looking at meters that could be achieved in a given time interval using different types of cues. And for the upper body, it showed that a broad internal cue around pulling with the arms versus folks on pulling the handle resulted in a slightly higher meterage that was achieved in what I believe were the 30-second intervals provided. Now, this is only one study, and it's the first that I've observed. And I think there were some external cues that would have been more effective that were not mentioned in the study. But either way, it was very well designed. Again, it's 2020, and I think it starts to articulate that possibly broad internal language, when compared to a lesser external cue, might have some value. The key thing here is in the evidence discerning between broad and narrow. The third type of cue, which really has not been researched, I think I've seen maybe one paper that hints at it, but again, this is an area that I really think could shed some value for practitioners. And that's this idea of a hybrid cue. And so what's a hybrid cue? Well, basically it's where you use an internal cue followed by an external cue. So drive your leg back into the ground as explosively as you can. So see what I've done there? I've explicitly called out the body, in this case using a broad internal cue, but then I've oriented it very specifically to the ground, to the environment, which is the province of an external cue. And in this instance, I'm of the belief that this is going to operate more like an external cue. It goes back to the peak end rule. What's the last thing I'm going to hear? The ground as explosively as you can. Ground is what is going to resonate. And what I like about a hybrid cue, I can say, drive your leg back into the ground as explosively as you can. But in doing that, I can now start to focus on just the ground. Okay, push the ground explosively. Push the ground explosively. It's giving them the knowledge of what, the insight of how, and then once we've made that coupling, I just focus on the cues that are external. The how-based cues push the ground away from then on out. 4, we then go ahead and say, hey, we don't even need to mention the body. As long as we give the clear outcome that we're trying to achieve, the body will self-organize around that goal and achieve it. And so that's a close external cue. Drive the ground back as explosively as you can. No mention of the body required. And for me, this would be where I would start. I believe this is, of the cues here, especially if it was a new person, this is the best of the bunch. Likely for me, I would have said, hey, our goal here is to get your leg back and get fully extended. To do that, drive the ground back as explosive as you can. So call it a hybrid or call it a close external. Finally, then we have a far external. And in this case, it's drive towards the finish as explosively as you can. And in this instance, rather than focusing literally on the ground that is right beneath me, that is literally close, we focus on where we are going, which is far away, and that's the finish line, wherever it might be. You could equally say, continue to focus on getting away from the blocks if he or she was coming out of the blocks as fast as they can. And obviously, the farther they are moving away from the blocks, the more the external focus, if maintained, becomes far. Now, again, we can't go through everything in these evening chats, but understand that the interaction of close versus far, there is some evidence to say that based on the task and based on the skill level of the individual, that in certain instances, close external cues are better, at least as a starting point, versus far. And just the punchline there is when you're doing accuracy-based tasks with an implement, so let's say tennis or golf, that early on, focusing on close external cues allow the person from a implicit perspective to couple the way they move, the way their body feels with the physical implement itself. But we know that implements inevitably get mapped into quite literally the cortical regions responsible for those movements. Let's say it's hitting a forehand in tennis. And that inevitably, if accuracy, which is most certainly the goal in something like tennis and golf, as that becomes dominant, and as the person becomes more expert-like, shifting to a far external focus is advised. Conversely, if it's non-implement based, something like a vertical jump or a horizontal jump, actually using a far external cue to make salient, that's a word we were introduced to in chapter 2, to make it more salient, I start with a far external cue because it allows me to deploy the power needed, let's say, for example, to jump out past a cone. And so the book clearly articulates these various nuances, but ultimately, close or far, it's still the province of an external cue, and ultimately it's about finding the one that works for the area you're trying to correct and the individual, in this case the athlete, trying to correct it. So this is our continuum of cues. More research needs to be done, but what we're sharing right now represents the vast majority, well over 96% by my estimates, saying that, hey, close external cue, far external cue, hybrid potentially, likely, broad, maybe in certain instances, narrow internal cue, rarely. To think about one joint or one muscle in the spirit of an entire movement that needs to be coordinated, to say that that is a natural form of learning, you're going to hard to convince anyone of that. How else would our children learn to move with such brilliance with zero verbal instruction from parents despite their best efforts? It's wah, 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 wah. And so oftentimes it's that narrow internal language, the province of the technical words we learn in our anatomy and our kinesiology books that serve us, that soothe us. But do they really soothe and serve the athlete? Especially when we all know so much about the dangers of paralysis by analysis, which ultimately comes from having too much information. Once you say it, you cannot take it back. So if you could learn a way to cue that still got the nuance across without them having to consider all the detail connected to that nuance, wouldn't that be a preferred way to not only coach, a better experience on behalf of the athlete, but ultimately one that serves the ends we are here for, and that is for them to learn. And this might be hard to see, is the paper I would encourage you to read in addition to Gabrielle Wolf's book, Attention and Motor Skill Learning. So Attentional Focus and Motor Learning, a review of 15 years. Now, this is 8 years old. The research has not pivoted a whole lot in the last 8 years. But if you want to deep dive into the evidence, that would be the suggested paper you read next. And so the final area that I want to discuss here as we look at this cueing and finding focus chapter are the last two sections. Now, these are entire sections of the book, so I'm not going to be able to do them service now, but I want to just touch on a couple high points. And so the second section of the Finding Focus chapter is called The Dark Side of the Cue. And the dark side of the cue, a little bit of a nod to Pink Floyd for any of our fans of them, is really meant to give you an insight into what can go wrong and likely what is going wrong when we use internal language. This steps away from the academic argument of internal versus external and gets to the bedrock principles of what happens when the mind is focusing on the body versus the mind is focusing on the outcome the body is trying to achieve. And the evidence in that section is overwhelming that when we look at the level of the muscle, at the level of the movement, and the mind-body connection, again and again and again, we see that an external cue centrates the mind on an outcome. From that outcome, the body can self-organize literally to achieve it. Too often, people feel that if they don't highlight the exact knee position or ankle position, that the body can't make the change. But again, I challenge you to go into your intuition. Go back to the realm where no coaches existed. And all we did is respond to the environment in the hunter-gatherer stage of our own evolution, where people were not teaching running and change of direction. For as long as humans have been around, we have organized our movements in terms of goals, in terms of outcomes, embedded perceptually in the environment we are operating in. The concept of an internal cue is a modern invention. The concept that athletes benefit from breaking their movement down and thinking step by step by step is a modern invention. Do not kid yourself. There is nothing natural about internal language. But does it have a value? Most certainly. It has a value psychologically in familiarizing the athlete with the movement, familiarizing them with the technique, allowing the inquisitive athlete to be informed about the nuances of the movement they are performing. But that is not the same as what they need to think about to achieve it. Let's make the distinction between knowledge and know-how. And so as a very brief summary for a critical section for the inquisitive mind, those are some of the key insights looking to glean out of that section. And then finally, this idea, which someone told me they were surprised pleasantly to see this section in the book. And that is this concept of you gotta be choking me. And so I finish with this section in the Finding Focus chapter for one simple reason, that if you investigate the work of Masters and Sion Beilock and Rob Gray and others who have looked at this simple question, what causes underperformance? What causes people to choke in competition? What they found in a naturalistic way, meaning they weren't giving people cues. They weren't asking people to think about internal versus external. They were trying to synthesize what's going on here when things aren't going right out there. And what they find again and again and again through, by various names, this concept of reinvestment. That when athletes underperform or extreme levels of underperformance that we call choking, what's typically going on is a reinvestment of focusing on the body. There is greater general awareness of body and movement. And you can argue at an implicit level, this is happening because if the moment I'm about to step into is one of great importance, would I not want to control everything that I can? And if my movement is ultimately the vehicle to achieve the outcome I desire, then logically, even if it doesn't summate to cognition and knowledge, it's logical that behaviorally, I would try to control this movement. And compound, if I am in a slump, or whatever the word is for the given sport, if I have a run of bad games, does it not make sense that I revert back to my developmental self? Okay, what did I do to get here? And if I was someone that had a very technical coach who used a lot of internal cues, would I not be inclined to go back to those internal cues, which quite literally Gabrielle Wolf and others have called micro choking events to define the underperformance compared to external cues that we oftentimes see when coaches use internal language. So these two areas are critical to give you bedrock understanding that take all the internal external focus papers and put them to the side. And naturalistically, we have evidence that, again, aligns to our intuitions that we organize movement in terms of outcomes. My book is about how do you frame the mind to get the nuance that normally you feel you can only get through internal language. And I found that that just takes practice. And once you understand the models, which we'll talk about here in this next section, you realize that the amount of nuance and detail you can get out of an athlete's movement, but still keeping their mind embedded, anchored in the environment, is near limitless in my experience. So cue it up. And as I said, this was going to be the biggest section so far in terms of Book Club 3. So I'm going to go over 90 minutes. I can tell you that now. So stay on as long as you can. Again, these recordings are all going up on YouTube. I have the link in the chat function, and it'll be up on my social media as well. But now to chapter 5. Personally, for me, it's tied. Chapter 5 and 6 are my favorites. This is the heartbeat of the book. This is what I have spent over a decade finding, identifying, experiencing. This is really where the rubber meets the road. And if one chapter was to be read, this is the one to read. So when we look at Cue It Up, the goal of the chapter is very simple. If you now buy in that the language you use impacts the way your athlete moves, and you also buy in the vast majority of cases, identifying the right external cue or analogy is the way to go, knowing that you can still educate with internal language in your description and in your debrief, well, this chapter is how do you become a ninja master when it comes to creating cues. Now, I have a primer in this chapter, which I believe is quite important, just to orient the mind around language and how we might need to shape our language to serve the person that we are working with. But even before I get into those language shaping modules, I share a very important story around running and a very important principle that I call positions before patterns. Now, as you'll recall, if you've read chapter 1, this is not a book on biomechanics per se, even though a ton of it is implied, especially in the latter chapters. But as I've said again and again, you need to know what to coach before you can consider how to coach it. The best external cues in the world are not going to help you if you have not identified the right movement error. And so positions before patterns is a very crude, simple, but I believe accurate heuristic, shorthand, mental model, if you would, that when you are analyzing movement, we want to work inside out. In that if there are issues with the major foundation on which movement is based, i.e. our positions, or our posture was the P I was looking for, we have to get those centrated. We have to get those on board before we start worrying about our limbs, our arms, and our legs. So positions before patterns basically says, I need to own my stability and mobility. I must be able to get into the key positions that this movement requires before I start looking at how I move from position A to position B, let's say. And so this just was another nod to our 3P model in making sure that you are put in the best position possible to identify the right error that your cues, or your clues as I sometimes call them, are meant to change or overcome. From there then we get right into the language. And let's be clear. What are we trying to do with our cues? Well, at the end of the day, with cues, we are trying to make meaning. We want to take the concepts that are in our mind, frame them with our words in such a way that it creates the same meaning, the same collective consciousness, the same shared understanding in our athlete's mind. And so literally, we are trying to make meaning with the cues that we use. When we talk about making meaning, I ask you as a reader to go through the following demonstration. And so for those of you that have not done this, I apologize. It's a little bit of a reveal, but I want to walk through some of the concepts behind it. And that is, what I ask you to do in the book is to read these verbs, right? These are action words. And in reading these verbs, I ask you simply to write down the picture that comes to mind. So the goal is to understand when you read the word blast or punch or shatter, what does that word mean to you? What meaning is derived, is synthesized, is pulled from those squiggly lines that we call letters that form a word? And after you've done this, I share the results of my exercise in doing it. And these are quite literally the images that come to mind, the meaning that comes to mind when I read these words. And what I want to highlight here is the following. And that is, if the image that comes to your mind is similar to the image that came to my mind, then likely when I use these words, which could be expanded out to a sentence or a phrase, that you are going to understand what I mean. However, one I like to joke on, if you read the word pop, and the first thing that comes to your mind is not this sudden kind of explosion like a firework or even better, a kernel popping from a popcorn perspective. If what comes to your mind is snap, crackle, pop, a breakfast cereal, then likely we're not going to share the same meaning when you hear the verb, the word pop. And so the key thing to understand is the reason that having a cueing model is so central is it allows you to quickly exchange, in this case, the verb, what I call the description within the cue. It allows you to quickly change this to make sure that the meaning you intend is the meaning that is accepted. And so it's a useful exercise to demonstrate that. When we talk about then making meaning, whether or not you have it, let's say you don't, that's the whole purpose of this initial primer. What do you need to do? Well, sometimes you need to say less. And this goes back to my original point that I brought up earlier, that if your cues are hidden inside of your descriptions, oftentimes those cues are going to get lost. And you're leaving the athlete to identify those gems on their own, which means you're not consistently connecting your language to their focus, to their movement. And so sometimes you need to generally say less so that the point you're trying to make, the meaning you are trying to share, stands out. Sometimes, though, you need to say more. You know, as coaches, and I see this especially with sport coaches, they create this shorthand language all the time. But the problem is, if you've developed this shorthand language for a given movement, you know, let's say it's something like in rugby, we'll talk about get on the floor. If you're working with a young athlete who's never heard get on the floor, I mean, sure, they understand that generally to get on the floor, but if they don't understand the deeper meaning of what get on the floor means in a rugby context, then oftentimes that's just going to go straight over their head. And so that's why later on, I talk about always starting with the long cue. Start with the full cue, even the hybrid, where you give them, hey, internally, this is what the body should do, and externally, here's what I want you to focus on to achieve it. And so sometimes you need to say more because they have not gotten enough context, enough detail in the cue that you gave. And then sometimes you need to say it differently. Going back to my example of the word pop, if I'm using a verb, an action word, or an analogy that doesn't mean anything to you, or possibly means something opposite to what I intended, or at the very least different than what I intended, then I'm going to need to be able to get there, understand that, and change my language altogether. And so recognize with any phrase, with any cue, this is the first area that I want you to go. Do I need to say a little bit less? Was it too lengthy? Possibly do I need to give them a bit more detail, say more, or do I need to abandon the whole thing, refresh the cue, and say it differently? The only way you know this is if you involve the athlete in the learning process. And this is why having conversations to come up with the cue or collaborating to come up with the cue, and most certainly using that debrief, not as a one-sided street or a one-way street just to tell them what you think, but to really say, okay, what did you focus on during the movement? Like that's something that I used to never say. But once I started to ask people, what did you focus on in the movement? I came to find out there were many times where they weren't even focusing on what I asked them to focus on. And so ultimately I said, listen, if we come up with a cue, whether it's me, you, or us together, you need to focus on it while you move. That we need to teach you to focus and own your mind in the same way you're trying to own your body. And once I had that brief discussion, let them in on what I was trying to achieve, all of a sudden everyone's focusing and they're seeing the benefit of it. Because only if they're focusing on it can then they say to me, yeah, Nick, made sense, felt good. Let's keep it up. Great. Or, yeah, Nick, made sense, didn't like it. I think this would be better. But only through knowing that they focused on it, giving them one thing to focus on and having that discussion, will you know less, more, or different. And so these are just high-level concepts that generally I would encourage you to think about and apply when we talk about cueing. So now in this final section here, we're going to get into cueing in 3D. What's the actual model that we use to bring these external cues to life? And so when we talk about this, there are three major components. I'm going to go through the model, and then I'm going to give some examples that we all can use. And so when it comes to the cue, the first major variable is the distance the cue is promoting. We've already talked about this. Is it promoting something that is close to me or far away? Notably, the distance in your cue is articulated by the noun, the person, place, or thing. So pushing the ground away, the ground is the noun, the ground is close. Driving towards the finish line is the noun, it's far away, thus it's far. Again, outside of some of the early evidence that suggests for certain people and certain skills, close versus far, one might be better than the other. At this stage, I really just want you to think of those as variables you can manipulate to optimize an outcome, a variable you can play with when you need to say it differently, or possibly say more or say less. Those three principles all play into how the cue comes to life and how you shape it, with this being one of the variables. The second variable is direction. Quite literally, distance and direction create the navigation the cue provides. Where am I moving in space? And I'm either moving towards something or away from something, towards something or away. Interestingly enough, someone messaged me the other day, and I was familiar with this, NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. It's the basis for, well, many individuals' work and kind of the mindfulness and the coaching and the let's call it professional coaching space. I think Tony Robbins bases a lot of his work on NLP, but NLP has a concept of forward motivated versus backward motivated. Am I motivated towards goals or away from failure? Maybe there's something to that and what people prefer, but I can tell you right now, different strokes for different folks. If I tell you guys, okay, you can either focus on pushing away from the line or towards the finish, or in the bench press, away from the bench or toward the ceiling with the barbell, which would you prefer? You're not going to get 100% one way or the other. And so directionality and the way our mind works on how we want to shape a movement seems to be different across individuals and across movements. So again, I'm making no statement of one being better than the other, but in the province of an external cue, away and toward, like distance, close and far, are variables you can play around with. Within the cue, and I give you plenty of instances to play around with these in the book, the preposition, which is basically the GPS of language, toward, away, into, out of, from, so on and so forth. These are all words that will change the directionality of the cue you are using. Again, one is not better than the other. I think in the book, I give the difference between into the ground versus off the ground in a sprinting context. And just think about that for yourself. Into versus off of. Into suggests something heavy, forceful, get into the ground. Off of suggests something reactive, something quite quick. So just by shifting the preposition, just by shifting the directionality of the cue, you can reshape the nuance of how the movement is coordinated. And then finally, we have the description, not to be confused with the description inside of our coaching communication loop, but this is the description within the physical external cue itself. And this is the verb. This is the action word. This is the drive, pop, punch, explode. It is literally the heartbeat of the cue. And this comes through in the action words we use, the verbs, and the analogies. In both cases, they are trying to imbue motion into the language. Distance and direction, talk to me about space. The description, the verb, talk to me about time. Where am I going and how fast am I going to get there? And how am I going to get there? And together, we see these three variables work together to give us the anatomy of a cue. And so here we have a couple examples. Focus on bursting out of the blocks. Bursting is my description. Out is my direction. Blocks, right? That's the noun. That sets the distance. It's close to me. In my bench press, focus on smashing the dumbbells through the ceiling. Smashing is my description. It's how to do it. Think of smashing versus using the word push. Do those feel the same to you? Probably not. And so the verb has a heavy influence on how the movement is coordinated, even though it isn't commenting on any one joint or any one muscle group. Through, there's your preposition, that's the direction, and then ceiling anchors the distance. It's the noun. It's where the movement is going towards, right? But equally, it could have been going away from the bench. The bench would have been the noun, and again, it would have established the distance. in that instance as being something closer to me because literally I'm laying on the bench. And so when we start to look at these words of the distance, the direction, and the description, I want to highlight something that I go to at a fair bit of length in multiple sections in the book, but why this is so important. It's easy to see our language as just some fluff, but the reality is language literally emerged out of action. And it's what we call embodied cognition. Insofar as how we process language, it is embodied, it is connected to the movements, literally, the language is trying to promote. And just a way to illustrate this is as follows. Let's say we use the word kick. If I have a person go and kick a ball, the part of their motor cortex associated with the lower body will obviously activate to send the signals to help that individual control the motion of kicking. But here's what's interesting. If this same person watches someone kick a ball, if this same person imagines someone kicking a ball, or even hears or reads the word kick, the regions of the brain associated with kicking still light up, such that embodied cognition suggests that we process language, notably we process action language, which is what we're talking about with cues. We process action language in the same parts of the brain responsible for bringing those actions to life. And once we understand that actions are oriented in terms of outcomes, and the reason our actions are oriented in terms of outcomes is because of these two things on our head. We see the environment around us through our visual cortex, which is one of the largest cortices in the brain, far larger than the verbal processing regions. We see the world and we respond to it. We perceive and then we act. We perceive and then we act. So it would make sense then that those same perception centers, outcome creating centers of the brain, are involved in the way we process language meant to influence those actions. And so our mind and our movement is the province literally of the environment we're trying to navigate. Thus, our cues are meant to be mental spotlights to help the athlete, client, or patient know what part of the environment, the information from a movement perspective is contained within, or how to interact with the environment to achieve the given outcome. We are using language that literally harmonizes with the environment that literally for millennia has guided how we move. These are ancient brain systems. Language has to jive, has to play by these brain systems rules. If I blind you with your language and ask you to only think about one muscle, one joint, my language leaves the real world. My language leaves the environment, which is the central information source needed to guide movement, which is why when our language harmonizes with the environment, external cues, outcomes, we see far better movement results. I speak with such passion about this because it has made a profound, lasting, to the point where I will dedicate the rest of my life to these concepts, impact on my life and my athletes. It is my mission to make sure that every movement professional out there brings this positivity to their own world, and notably the people they support. So coming to a close here, and then we'll stay on for questions. The way that I encourage you to think about this, these three variables, is like a lock, and that you are trying to find the right combination of descriptive, direction-based, and distance-based language to bring the cue to life so that it unlocks their movement. Altus put up a quote the other day from one of their individuals. I think it might be the Harvard track and field coach. And he said, the best cue is the one that works. I completely agree. And it's through this lens that we find the right combination to find the cue that works for the individual. So here's a couple examples just to take us home before we shift to questions. And towards the end of this chapter, I say, listen, you now have the 3 Ds, but In a practical setting, you need to know how each of these Ds works and how you need to change them or nudge them to get to the right cue for the person. And so the principles I have are as follows. It goes back to that idea of say less versus say more. Early on, I would encourage you to say the right amount. And for me, what's the right amount? The right amount is a cue that uses all 3 Ds. And so that's why we say start with 3. So here we have a baseline cue. At the bottom of the motion, reach the kettlebell at the wall behind you. Now, that's a long cue, but as a starting point, it gives them a balance of descriptive, right, knowledge of what they're about to do, and movement-based external language that they can use to actually focus the mind while they move. But after we start with 3, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. We have to have that capacity to say more, say less, or say it differently here. And so once you start with that baseline cue, if you're kind of happy with it, but you want to nudge it, the next thing that I encourage you to do is this whole idea of shift the Ds. And this is where you start playing around, literally playing around with distance, direction, and or description. So here I've simply just shifted the Ds. At the bottom of the motion, push the kettlebell into the wall behind you. You can start to see that instead of reach, I use the word push. Instead of at, I use the word into. And then finally, cue option 2, at the end of the motion, stretch the bottom of the bell away from your shirt collar. And so what we're doing here is we're maintaining the same meaning that we're trying to get out of our mind and into their body, but we're trying to find the right combination of words that impart the essence, the feel, the goal that results in the outcome that we're looking for and the outcome that they want to feel. So we start with 3, we make sure we give full context, then we shift the Ds, surgical precision to get the cue just right. And the shifting of the Ds can come from a conversation between you and the client or the athlete, or you could just shift them yourselves. Finally, then, we shorten and see. And so once we lay down a really good cue that we're happy with, so again, here we have at the bottom of the motion, push the kettlebell into the wall behind you. That's a mouthful. I can just shorten that. Push to the wall, or a single word, push, or possibly wall. And so oftentimes it is the noun, the physical part of the environment you want focus to be on, even if the focus is in the mind's eye, because obviously he cannot see the wall, but he knows it's behind him. Thus, it's still external. Or you want to give the single word that gives the essence, the vibrance of the movement, i.e. you have the word push. And so this is where, when it goes back to the sport coaching example, shorten and see, we get a lot of coaches that shorten their cues, but forget to expand them back out to the full length cue when a new person comes into their system. And so remember this yourself. If you've created a lot of short and condensed cues that you've earned and worked over the years, maybe sometimes if you find someone they don't work with, it's not because the cue itself is inherently bad, but because the cue didn't give them enough context. So go back to your start with 3, and then you can shorten and see from there. And the goal here is to start to give you, so to speak, the proverbial scalpel, the proverbial chisel, so you can start to shape your language in so many ways to capture the nuance, which is the mind-body connection, meaning to meaning transference that we're trying to generate with our coaching. Finally then, and this was one of my favorite sections to write, is this idea of Q-tips and a little play on words to help it be memorable. But the Q-tip section are really for those individuals coaching those movements that are really nuanced, where, when we talk about something like acrobatics, where oftentimes they don't have an external reference point like a baseball bat. Their only reference point are the 4 walls, the ceiling, and the ground. And even then they have to do a lot of complex movements in space. The question is, how can we still orient the body externally to help a person move better without always calling attention right to the body? And the way I talk about doing this is through 3 different strategies. The first one is what I call cue conversion. And a cue conversion, if you would, is kind of like the hybrid cue. It's where you say, listen, I need you to get better extension through your hips on this sprint. To do that, I want you to think about insert external cue here. And I think that's a really healthy way to cue. It's the best of both worlds. The key thing that I'm trying to promote is that we finish with the external cue, but we give both sources of information. And technically, if you look at the coaching communication loop, that's already implied with the description in the demonstration preceding the cue, as long as you organize your language as such. The second strategy is what I call cue cloth, just trying to be cute with some of these terms to make them memorable. And that is physically using the clothing. And so we talk about belt buckles, we talk about collars, we talk about waistbands, we talk about laces, we talk about, the base of the shoe. These are all beautiful reference points. And even though they are touching the body, the way they are processed in the mind does not appear to have the same constraining effect that talking about the action of a given muscle or a given joint. We don't represent them the same. They're treated more like a physical object that we're trying to move towards, within, against, away from, in space, similar to the ground. But the final one, which is my favorite, and again, if you have the book, you will have noticed for the 27 movements that span chapters 8, 9, and 10, which we'll talk about in the next one, I give cue tape examples for every single movement. That's how much I believe in this strategy. And so the one illustrated here, these little dots are quite literally meant to represent tape. And so I would put a piece of tape on the upper back and the lower back. Why? Simple. The error that this is demonstrating is a person who has a rounded back every time they come out of their stance. And so I can say chest up, get your back long, better extension. And I've had athletes like this. And for the life of me, nothing works. But now I can simply say, hey, I want you to take those two pieces of tape. Show me what they look like when they're getting far away. And they do this. Show me what the tape looks like when they're getting closer together. And they do this. And literally, let me be clear, like I have behind me, I am just taking strips of tape, putting them on the upper back and the lower back. And I say, smash the pieces of tape together. And all of a sudden, this highly nuanced, back-specific part of the technique comes to life, but doesn't impede the processing and the aggressiveness of the overall movement outcome, which is to get off the line. And so that's why I've provided so many examples of using cue tape, because it's a way to hack what I believe people are trying to get with internal language, but in a manner that is still authentic to the external cueing methodology and neurology. And so ultimately, here we go. Again, I do apologize for those of you. I know it's going over, but hopefully the information is valuable if you're still on here with me. I end this chapter with this quote, and I think if you actually read into it, there's a bit of wordplay, there's a bit of analogy, but it captures the depth of what we're talking about here, but also the simplicity of the strategy. And that is, cues are the vehicle we use to navigate the terrain of the mind in hopes that we will arrive at a desired movement destination. And that's really what it's about. It's using cues that are embedded in that literal movement destination to help them formulate in the mind's eye a movement to achieve it. And language is what we use, whether it comes from us or comes from the athlete, to help them quite literally navigate the space of the mind so they can be better at navigating the physical space of the environment. As promised with each of these, I want to provide a few different book recommendations. If you've read this chapter, you know that The Inner Game of Tennis is central to my philosophy. It's a wonderful short read, again, written back in 1974. If you're like me, it makes you furious you didn't read it sooner. Choke by Dr. Sian Beilock. A lot of her work is covered in chapter 4, Finding Focus, in the You Gotta Be Choking Me part of the chapter. And then finally, I quote him throughout the book. He was a man ahead of his time. You haven't taught until they have learned, by Sven Nader and Ronald Gallimore. Sven was Coach Wooden's player, and Ronald Gallimore wrote the only paper in existence back, I believe it was in 1976. He actually observed Coach Wooden's final year and was able to document his great teaching practices, which most certainly align with everything we are talking about. So, beautiful book that I highly recommend. And again, here, before we shift to questions, I know many of you are still on, so thank you. Oh, the key thing for me is we have one more of these. It's going to be on July 15th. I really encourage you to attend that one. At the very least, watch the recording. We are going to go through the roadmap. We're going to start to go through how do you actually bring these concepts to life in your practice and go through some of the examples of the coaching communication loop. And the other thing, and again, I hate that I even have to say this, but I'm trying to make sure that this book reaches the widest population possible. So if you believe in this message and what I'm trying to share in your own practice and beyond, please get on Amazon or your preferred site and leave a review. I greatly appreciate it, and forever I will be grateful for all of you supporting the book. It's only through that support that ultimately we're going to be able to achieve the impact globally in coaching that I hope I and we are after. So with that, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to shift over to questions. So again, for those of you that are still on with us, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box. It can relate to, let's say, past chapters. Since we've already covered them, it can relate to the chapters in discussion tonight. And obviously, if anything relates to analogies, I'm happy to field them today as well. And so I see that we have a number of questions. Keep throwing them in. Otherwise, I will let you guys go on time if we only have these 4. So Sue Humphrey, thank you for your question. Where on your website can we sign up for the free course? Great question. If you go over to thelanguageofcoaching.com, there will be a little box that pops up that says subscribe. There's also a little box right in the center of the screen that says subscribe. If you put your email in there, Sue, you will get an immediate email that has all the details on the course. There isn't any one spot on the website. It comes as a byproduct of the actual subscription. Matt, what would a close external cue be for a person finding it hard to keep their back straight on squats? More specifically on the ascending phase of the move, resulting in the person folding over. I wrote focus on showing the logo of your t-shirt to the mirror. I'm just curious to know your thoughts on this. Really interesting, Matt. When we look at close versus far, toward and away, by the very nature of those qualities of our language and quality of our movement, we're thinking about moving somewhere. When we talk about a body position, a body posture, we want it to fundamentally be static. We want it to be immovable. And as I like to say to my athletes, we want their arms and legs to move around their body rather than their body around their arms and their legs. And so, as I like to share, the 3D model by no means is a set of rules. It's a set of principles that can help guide you towards the right cue. And in fairness, the cue that you're using, Matt, is one I use all the time. You know, here I'm using my Navy shirt that one of my good friends, Brian Miller, gave me. I would talk about, hey, keep the Navy symbol up, or show the mirror the Navy symbol. You could also, though, if you wanted to reverse that, say, keep the symbol away from the ground, or don't show the ground your letters. And in that case, we have a toward, keep this toward the mirror, and we have an away, get it away. So even as I was talking through it, I guess we were able to formulate a toward versus away. But in that instance, I think you've nailed the cue that I would use. Notably, and we'll talk about this next time, I tend to use analogies quite a bit when it comes to the nuances of body posture, simply because at times, because the arms and legs are moving, I can orient them fairly easily with walls, ceiling, ground. But the posture at times can be troublesome to figure out how to actually anchor it in space because it is stuck between only limbs. And there's not always an obvious external anchor point. And so if I talk about hey, I need your body position being like steel, or I need you to imagine that your spine is like a bungee cord. And when it's like this, flexed and loose, that's a loose bungee cord. I want you to think about stretching and getting that spine long as if to stretch the bungee cord. And I leave the stretch the bungee cord as the final idea in the mind. So hopefully that gives you some nuance and some flavor there, Matt. Thank you for your question. Jim, I had the fortunate opportunity to observe a deaf strength coach lead a movement session and marveled at their ability to conduct the session in the absence of words and without any external cueing. Do you see a successful scenario where language isn't a piece of a successful cue? Put another way, can I say more with nothing and focus solely on the demonstrate portion of the long loop and still get through to athletes? You know, it's funny, Jim. I'll share this book I'm reading right here, Teaching with Your Mouth Shut. And so what's really interesting is while you might think that this book is anti-language, it's not anti-language, but rather it's highlighting what can happen when we remove language or only use it to precisely focus the mind on the environment or things that matter, allowing, if you would, the athlete, client, or patient to self-organize. And so even though I wrote this book, which might seem to be the antithesis, The Language of Coaching, nothing in The Language of Coaching suggests that language has to be dominant, but rather when we do use language, how do we get the most out of it? That's the objective here. And so here's what's really cool. When I demonstrate, where's the information coming in? The information is coming in my eyes. And so I'm using, in this case, my visual cortex to process what I'm seeing. When I watch the person move, what am I implicitly doing? I'm watching how they organize and shape their movement to the literal environment in front of me. And even if we talk about the use of constraints, where I use cones and less opponents or more opponents to change the environment, what am I changing? I'm changing the physical environment. And I'm changing, because of that environment, how I respond to it. Now that should sound like something. Those are external focus points. And so do I have to always use a cue to get my athlete to focus externally? No, I would say the default for most people is focusing externally. And one of the best ways to promote an external focus is through rich demonstrations or creating physical drills and constraints that force my attention to be in a certain part of my environment and just respond. Is there anything fundamentally negative about using language? Absolutely not. When used in the right amounts and the right way to focus attention on outcomes and environment, it synergizes. It connects me to my environment, not the other way around. But ultimately, as we would have talked about with the concept of silent sets in one of the earlier book clubs, we have to create space, Jim, for them to own the movement. And thus, if I can get a change, especially early on, when I'm first introducing concepts, to allow them to mirror my demonstration, or with a little bit of instruction, just trial and error themselves, 100%. That's very much so in the spirit of my coaching style. The key thing is, once the body gets to good enough, once they can basically achieve a given outcome, the brain and the body are not naturally anchored to optimization. We have to remember that our sporting movements that we coach, notably, are human-made creations. There's nothing natural about them in a survival sense. And so because, and I'm writing a chapter on this right now, we oftentimes from a self-organization and a self-correction perspective default to good enough. It's how do you get them beyond that? How do you help them focus in such a way where they can make these small nuanced changes to get from good enough to great when and where it matters? And that's where language, I would argue, becomes notably important. Equally, I would say that not everyone is just going to respond well to a demonstration. Sometimes you're still going to have to use language to get your point across, oftentimes synergized with it. And so the big thing I like to say, it's not about language or not language. It's not about constraint or not constraint. It's about better constraints and better language. Thank you, Jim. Great question. Okay, Ron. Thank you for taking the time to do this. I noticed in your cue progression, you replaced bottom with end. Will you please speak to the difference between the cues end and bottom in a kettlebell swing? So very interesting. So I'd have to go back and take a look at it, but end versus bottom, again, kind of would be like push versus punch for me. And so if we talk about a different way to think about the end of something, so I could argue this is the end of the kettlebell or the bottom of the kettlebell, it just comes down to different words being used to convey the same meaning. I mean, at the end of the day, we have the word synonyms for a reason. Many different words that in different contexts can mean the exact same thing. And so, Ron, without actually having the slide just in front of me, I would say it's just a different way to say the same thing. And that's the beauty of the 3D cueing model, is that each of our Ds allow us to still convey the same meaning, shape our language, distance, direction, description, in a manner that makes the most sense to the person in front of us. At the end of the day, it's not what makes sense to me, because obviously that's the cue I lead with. It's what makes sense to them. And so hopefully that gives you an insight, at least what's going on in the back of my mind. Scott, how do you cue externally in rehab setting when you want to have a patient focus on their movement, not just the results, avoiding knee valgus and landing jumping? And so again, this gets into a philosophical debate on whether or not a person needs to focus on knee position and valgus. There's a number of great studies by Ann Benjamins and Ali Gokler that would argue in a rehab setting, you don't need to focus on those things to achieve an outcome. But let's say that you do want them. You want them to think about their knees or their body. I have a book here. You know, if we look at Feldenkrais, we look at somatics. These are books that talk about body awareness and the importance of thinking about the body. But for me, oftentimes, when I talk about thinking about the body, it's in a retrospective sense. That after the movement is done, how did that feel? Did that feel light? Did that feel heavy? Did your knees feel to be in or feel to be out? And they say, maybe they say in. Okay, well, in the next one, I want you to imagine there's lasers coming out of your knees. We want to keep those lasers pointed straight ahead. And so I still think we can tap into the body awareness and the somatics, because awareness, let's not forget, requires something to have already happened. I cannot be aware of something that has not occurred. That is very different than giving internal cues, which are top-down intentional. If I give you an internal cue, I'm asking you to actively control something, not necessarily be aware of it. And so in the book, I believe it's in chapter 5, I have an entire section about awareness. And awareness is the province of awareness through movement and somatics. These both talk about how we're aware of our movement and our body. That is very different than trying to control a pattern. It's about observing a pattern. And I use language all the time, especially in my debrief, that taps into that body awareness. And so I might say, hey, I want you to be aware of your knee position on your next repetition. And for some people, that's going to allow them to self-correct. Equally, I might use an external cue. The lasers or the flashlights, or possibly a constraint. Bring in a mini band. What I'm not going to say is keep your knees out. If that was my only strategy, I believe, just in the examples I've given, there are far better ways that'll be less disruptive. In our manner of step stoning to them controlling a complex multi-joint movement, we cannot forget that each step we take matters. And ultimately, it's in service of the environment and the outcome that our movement is organized. The earlier we can bring that language through analogy and external cues, the better. Really good question. My good friend Nadine. Nick, can you explain a bit more about the section on athletes self-selecting external cues over internal cues? I find a lot of coaches who would say the cue that works is the best one and the athlete wants the internal. I find this is because how athletes have been trained to think, which is comfortable to them, even if detrimental, versus external, which is intuitive. Can you give some strategies for helping those who are skeptical, coaches and athletes, give a concept that it isn't as comfortable initially a chance? Okay, so what Nadine is saying here is what happens when you have an athlete come to you who's been coached for a long time with internal cues? And in using those internal cues, that's what they're comfortable with. And so if you try to change them to an external cue, it's not that the external cue doesn't work. It's that psychologically, they're not accepting it. And so already their belief is interfering with their intention. Because if you don't believe something, are you going to fully unlock your mind and allow intention to commit to it? Probably not. And so in those instances, I might say, hey, here's the movement we're performing. How would you, let's say this is an elite individual. They know what they're doing, okay? How would you normally focus on this? And so this was something for me that's a very important discussion to have. And if they start giving me a lot of internal cues, I find this in baseball all the time, pitching coaches and hitting coaches, Nadine asked this exact question, that now with the internet, people are so educated about the biomechanics of their movement, they're confusing that with what they should focus on while they move to achieve those biomechanics. And so what I would say to them is, okay, here, you're giving me all this detail, beautiful. You obviously understand the movement. Now, tell me what you actually focus on while you move. And Nadine, that's a really interesting question. Tell me what you actually focus on while you move. And they'll start to give you the same script of internal language. They're like, well, hold on. Well, I just kind of move. Well, how do you mentally get into the same consistency each time? And so ultimately what we'll do is some kind of cue conversion where I'll take their internal cues, say, okay, this is exactly, you're right. This is what we need you to do. Now to achieve this, what do you think we can focus on to actually get there? Or why don't you try focusing on this to achieve that outcome? And what I try to do is color their internal language as the outcome, the what, so to speak, of the movement, but continue to guide the discussion towards the how. How are we going to achieve that? And you've given me 5 things, but can you focus on all 5 of those while you're moving? And inevitably they'll say no. Say, okay, what's the one thing? What's one thing we can think about that we think will help us get there? And I'm not saying this is a one conversation, one and done. For some people it is, for others not as much. But it's highlighting, as I've done tonight, the difference between their descriptive, explanatory language and focus. Right? Explanatory language is in the province of thinking, in words. Whereas I want my words to turn into focus, something that I can see in the mind's eye or literally in front of me. That's what an external cue is. And so it's a matter of just guiding them. But implied in Nadine's question is something important. Do not disrespect their past coaches. I know you wouldn't. Do not disrespect their past coaches, and do not disrespect something that obviously, especially if they're elite, has worked for them. And so we start where they're at, and ultimately we try to get to a conversion process. If they're so far gone, it's kind of like technique. I might not try to change their cues at all. That might not be my position to do that. And so it's not an easy question, Nadine. I've faced it though many times. And what I'm outlining is this discussion and kind of using almost a motivational question-based interviewing technique to get them to the conclusion that, wow, I can't focus on all these things simultaneously. And so what's that one idea? Well, hiding inside of an internal cue and analogy is all the detail, whereas an internal cue only gives me one piece of the puzzle. So do I want the whole picture or only one piece? Inevitably, the athlete realizes they want to be able to generate the whole picture, and that's going to lead them to external cues and analogies. Really good question, Nadine. Thank you, Matt. I think I have one other question here from Bailey. In track and field event like triple jump, where there are 3 distinct phases, I love this question, how would I approach cues? Break down the movements or the total performance? Brilliant question. Cueing and attention is a temporal parameter in that in a given moment, I can only focus on one major thing. However, in the 100 meters, the triple jump, even I'd say in the long jump, where from a temporal perspective, it's not like hitting a baseball where it's one instant or hitting a golf ball where it's one instant. It's a continuous activity. And because you have that temporality, you have actual time, Bailey, what I would say is you could have the start focus, you could have the approach focus, and you could have the takeoff focus. For the 100 meter, it's the start focus. It's likely start and acceleration might be one and the same, but you might have a start, a late stage XL transition, and then a max velocity finish. 100%, you're still applying the principles. Now, for any given session, we're probably focusing on one of those areas. Well, it's still the one-to-one for that given moment in time. But if I have 3 distinct moments of time that are all anchored to specific technical outcomes, most certainly you would want to generate and ritualize the right cues for each of those moments to guide the movement pattern. So really good question to end on. And we're just over, but not too bad. For those of you still on, thank you so much for your time. Again, I've put the link in the chat function. It's right there to the YouTube channel. Both sessions 1 and 2 are already up. I'll have this up by, if not by Friday, by Monday at the latest for you to review. Again, our next session is coming up on July 15th. It's our 4th and final. What I'm probably going to do after this, for those of you that still want to stay engaged, is I'm probably going to drop this down to a very small group, possibly invite only. I haven't decided yet, where instead of webinars, it's a Zoom meeting. We can all see each other and actually start to share some coaching film, going through case studies and creating a little bit of a mastermind group to apply these principles and looking at how we coach, not only verbally, but as was alluded to earlier, non-verbally. You know, my book focused on one of the key features, but equally knowing how to design an environment to drive a change is equally important in the toolbox that is our coaching. So that's going to be it though for this evening. Thank you all so much. Wherever you are in the world, be safe, and cheers till next time. Thank you so much.